architectural discourse really starts to appear at the end of the 19th century and into the, at the end of the 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th. And for the show, in a way, we already looked at some of the firms that began a little bit before 1914 because they are the ones that produced some of the first works from Rem's 1914 mark onward. And there's a number of things like that year period that we accept as sort of arbitrary constraints throughout the process because we needed constraints to operate. One of them will be also the size of the wall surface that we have to work with. It will become a relevant sort of decider when it comes to how many objects we are actually presenting. So in the Biennale, and especially given Koolhaas's several proclamations about it, it seemed to us, the three curators, that the curation of the pavilion had to come to terms with the US architectural profession's global impact, regardless of what anyone else did in the Biennale. And this is, again, one place where, as Hyungmin was doing, I want to sort of distinguish the curatorial project from a historical project. If we were seriously looking at US export over 100 years as a historical project, among other things, we would actually really have to understand it in relation to other countries operating similarly. But that was not something that we were taking on in this case. The particular Rem pressures that we took seriously, though with already formed biases in all of our work, and in some way we came up with aspects, the key aspects of the project before we fully understood or heard Rem's requests. But nonetheless, the ones that we really cared about was a kind of set of statements that he made about the potential flattening of global architecture. This was a provocation on his part. And then his question or proposal that we would be looking, or that he would be at least looking for a kind of elemental unit of architectural intelligence. Both of these for us led us to the office as a key sort of site at which we could discuss an aspect of what it means to produce architecture. So rather than looking at elements in the sense that he was looking at, and we thought one has to look at how one produces architecture. The question on the kind of global flattening, for me, I took it as a provocation from Rem. I thought that if one actually believed that through shared processes of financing, production, or even image culture in architecture, we have arrived at the moment where there is more sameness across the globe, then it made some sense to me that one would look into elements and sort of look at stories that are part of those elements to reinvigorate the scene. For us, though, the question of globality was the one where we sort of drove towards the question of producing architecture abroad, because we wanted to look at a kind of production abroad as a specific site of absorbing, disseminating, and inflecting both American modernity and modernism, as well as the one of the locales where offices were operating. And it seemed important to us because the moment we started researching the office, we realized that, at least according to some researches or calculations, 2 out of top 5 US offices, 2 out of, so out of top 5 global offices, meaning largest in terms of the number of employees and largest in terms of revenue, 2 of those were US, Gensler and ACOM. And though these 2 offices are very different, these are offices that produce work across the globe, that have offices across the globe. And so it seemed to us important to at least in some way either corroborate or deny this proposal that architecture is getting flattened, and to look at US's role in that flattening. But the way that we wanted to answer the provocation was really through a kind of project in relearning how to see difference. And that in some cases meant sort of taking the focus off of the the architectural object and understanding it in the circumstances in which it was produced. So, as many of you know, and if you don't, or now, OfficeUS is a layered project with many moving parts. Ambitions at different levels, sometimes ones that work together, sometimes that work dialectically opposed to each other, sometimes they simply cancel each other, unfortunately. But I want to attempt to actually explain every aspect of it. Though we need to know the two key pieces of the exhibit, and I'll only sketch out what those are. So on one end is the repository, made up of binders or something, or folders that we based on the kind of notion of the ubiquitous three-ring binder that one still finds in every architectural office in the US at least. That's a project binder that contains information. We included 850 items in the repository. Of those, 180 were dedicated to explaining offices, when they were made, who were the partners, how they were organized, and over 700 of them were dedicated to projects that were built by those offices outside of the US. And each of the binders was including, when they were projects, we were looking for architectural descriptions of the project on one end, as well as a kind of press archive on the other. So if you wanted to, you could pick them off the wall and start, sit down and stay for a long time in the office. The other side of the project, or the second really important part that really in many ways then affects the rest of our curatorial decisions, is the live office on the ground. That was, and here are some of the partners together with the curators and the designers. And the live office is there. Our intention was that these set of people that we chose to an open call would in a way, both throughout the process of the Biennale and their work, be able to produce more critique, more research, and potentially ideas about how a contemporary office and even a global office ought to be organized, or ought not to be organized. So the two pieces are really important for us. Without them, you don't really get the whole project. For these characters, we produced 25 particular issues to go with the 25 weeks of the Biennale. So every week, OfficeUS has a topic through which to enter the repository. And we organized or tethered those issues to particular projects that you find historically across the 100 years. Now, before we go deeper into the project, and I realize it's not feels like halfway already, but it's an important moment, I would like to acknowledge both the MIT Department and School of Architecture and their leaders at the time, Adele Santos and Adair Tehani, for supporting the mammoth research project that basically took place here over the last year, and the 20+ individuals who took part in the project. And especially Michael Kubel, who's not here today, as he's at the Heinz Architecture Center in Pittsburgh, but who was an associate curator on the project, and whose text I think we circulated. I actually don't know if we ever circulated. Did we? Oh, wait, no. And so, there's no historian who would, in their right mind, claim expertise on 100 years of US architectural development. And Michael certainly wouldn't. But his encyclopedic knowledge of the last, at least certain parts of it, is as close as anyone could possibly get to becoming an expert on the topic in 10 months. The MIT students who were working on the project from several different programs were researching, scanning, compiling, mapping, and this particular team here went with me to Venice to actually install. We were not super numerous, basically in Venice. There we were outnumbered by Ohio students and storefront staff. But the research at MIT sort of looked this way. We were researching, or we were culling through architectural magazines, mapping the entirety of the question that we were looking at, organizing, testing it, and then ultimately in Venice, literally, screwing it together and organizing it on the wall. And also on the MIT end, we were helped by Jane, Rebecca, Doug, Hannah, Patricia, and Duncan, both through their tolerance for the project and active support. Now, everything about this project is huge, and that was a curatorial decision that was, for us, in line with the science of responsibility we felt the US Pavilion should take on, given the question on the table. It's also obviously something you could relate to our particular characters, but we're not going to go to that. It's also a decision that we most often regretted throughout the process. And so one of the first things I have to claim for the project, or about the project, that is, despite the signal of comprehensiveness that's undeniable when you enter and look at the images of it, the project is really merely scratching the surface of the topic of US architectural work abroad. So its aim from the outset is, and curatorially, is that it would launch many possible tracks of discussion and research. And so the repository is produced with the idea, at least abstractly, we understand we have a set of characters who are going to be really looking at it the whole time that the Biennale is in motion, and as well as obviously the way that we imagine an audience to this is that it would scratch the surface, go deeper into it, and actually see connections that we hope take them further. Now, the remaining time that I would like, the remaining time I have, I'd like to use to really explain a couple of things that were important for us here in the MIT trench. Right? So, while I was personally involved in every minute decision about, design of the space, the partners, the graphic identity, etc., we were really, in a way, organized very differently than your description of the Korean Pavilion, maybe as an office. What's important for the MIT team was really the research. The MIT involvement was in the production of research and content for this exhibit. And so, since the three curators proposed from the outset that we would examine and we hope somehow reactivate, rework historical material in order to draw appropriately contemporary conclusions, and choosing a topic in a way it's so that we could undo some already received narratives about what the 100 years were about. It seemed to Michael Kuba and I, right, that the precedent that we wanted to return to an equally sort of rework for our own curatorial and exhibition purposes was Arthur Drexler's 1979 exhibit at MoMA, Transformations in Modern Architecture. So he mounted a show out of 400 photographs presenting over 300 US firms in '79. And he refused, at least this is what he's saying, he refused to take on, by then established MoMA, proselytizing missionary role in promoting modernism. Obviously this is debatable because if you know Drexler's history in '75, he's mounting the Beaux-Arts show, so really he's already kind of promoting a certain form of postmodernism, so this works in that way. But nonetheless, what he says is that he wants to present, quote from him, bewildering, profuse, overloaded, contradictory, inconsistent, largely mediocre works as a critical mirror of the 1979 reality of US architecture. So he was interested in a total visual experience that would be understandable to all. Therefore, he uses photographs, but arguably at the price of real architectural difference. And needless to say, this is the key way in which he is critiqued at the time, especially from the architectural establishment. And I think especially Ken Franklin sort of takes him to task or tries to about his use of photography over other media to present architecture. Now, the parallels between transformations and OfficeUS, some of them might be obvious, right? We looked at about 300 firms that could claim they produced work outside of the country in the last century. We looked at over 3,000 projects before we made that 180 firms and 700 projects. We chose to rely on photography of the built work for the covers and photographs and diagrams of offices for the office folders. But we also, in each case, in each binder, included a kind of depth and an invitation to have a deeper engagement with the work, so that nobody could say, and this is not really why we did. We felt that one could look at architecture, but should also look at it in both the larger context and the deeper context. And in fact, this is a diagram I can decipher for you. These are all the firms that we included. I know you can't read them, but just the larger pattern out of this will be, these are the lifespans of all the firms that we included in the repository. And the red dots, insofar as you can see them, are actual projects that they made abroad. So you start to see certain patterns. Some of the oldest firms are still keeping. The Depression, pulled out a few. Then the sort of oil crisis, in some cases, shot down a few others. And also what's changing across this period is that the distance from the moment of inception of the firm to their first project abroad is shrinking. So the current firms, the most contemporary firms here are their first projects sometimes is outside of the US. So, although Drexler relied on formal similarities for his ultimate statements in this particular show that I'm evoking, we allowed for similarities to emerge on their own, organizing the repository chronologically. So what we were highlighting were really historical circumstances at work, and we were really using some of the trends that we were interested in to figure out what work should be part of this project. So, in that final instance, choosing the edge of banality, when one is looking at the 48th HFK project tower in China, it's really mediocre. The question for us was, is this project participating in an important, in producing or making more clear to us a narrative that's important about this office, or about a larger geopolitical movement of architectural firms across the globe? And so this is to say that, I will now use mediocre twice. This is to say that what we were interested here was a body of work that would represent somehow appropriately the whole body of work that US firms were producing abroad, which includes some excellent pieces, real inventions, and some dogs. But we wanted both of those to exist so that everyone looking at this would have to, in a way, decide for themselves what they thought US production abroad contributed globally. Also, unlike Drexler, so for example, here you see the thing that I'm saying, that the trend starts to emerge. Obviously, at a particular historical moment, right after the Second World War, we're going to see a lot of embassies. And there's a number of things that we were doing in the repository that allowed certain kind of navigation without really twisting your arm too hard. And so in that sense, we have, for example, the State Department seal that every embassy has on the embassy covers, which you're seeing here. Or here you start to see that actually, Frank Lloyd Wright had a very good logo for the era in which the office existed. Unlike Drexler, we also attempted to make some larger patterns visible out of this enormous amount of research that we produced. And so, but we didn't want to have a kind of an AMO diagram exhibit. So these diagrams are available, published at this point, and some of them will be, and new ones will be produced for the book that we're currently working on. It's a 1,200-page OfficeUS atlas. It's also available as a screensaver in the office on site. But basically, for example, here this is a map that tracks emigres in our amongst our 180 firms and their first project abroad. Obviously, you see this is a kind of the pre-Second World War collection of them who all tend to come back actually to their own country. Some of these were merely proving what we already thought we would find. So in this particular, in this particular case, we were looking at the way in which our projects, or the projects that we found, tracked with the rise of the currency in the countries in which they were situated. We were interested in the narrative of oil generally, and it starts really in Latin America before the Second World War. But then we're focusing here on the Middle East during the oil crisis, and because a number of projects really happened in this particular location. As some U.S. firms run out of work in the U.S., they migrate to this. Then one of the big programs or sort of lines that we trace throughout the whole thing that we are sort of cultivating or shepherding throughout the project was the embassies. And in this case, we are mapping where and when the attacks occurred. So you start to see obviously something that if you've been paying attention to the embassies, you know the kind of heyday of the embassy program is 53 to 57. Some excellent buildings are built then. And then slowly they lose money, there are attacks, and now we're in a new phase of design excellence. How that fares. So all of these larger concerns for us, they're not necessarily obvious if you go to the pavilion. You can find the 25 issues that I said are sort of doors into the exhibit for the office there. And we know that in a way the kind of interested, discerning architect, maybe historian that we had imagined, maybe future architect or historian, that we imagined would be our character. We knew this was not something we can absolutely rely on. But we were hoping that therefore the live office on the ground would in fact at any given point in time be addressing a project in greater depth. And as a visitor, you would be able to both talk to them and see what is going on as a result of their engagement with that particular topic. So the kind of aspect of the project where there's greatest uncertainty, obviously, is the live office on the ground that is charged with doing whatever these characters in their particular moment in time in their life think is necessary to do in relation and in response to the set of things that we put on the table for them to do. And that may or may not work. Their particular interests might actually produce a critical body of work, but they might not. And in that sense, they're also kind of there, sort of like a different kind than the repository. Drexler, despite the key differences that exist between them, there are obviously some things that we were interested in when we were looking at this exhibit. And so Michael and I especially put this response that he produced to his critics published in Skyline. We put it aside as a piece that we will base our rebuttal to critic. And thankfully we're still sitting on this piece. Tactless in a way that we could deploy them. Another really important interlocutor for us is Henry Russell Hitchcock, whose several attempts to come to terms with what might constitute an American architectural practice help us think about the relationship between the office, its internal organization, and its ability to build abroad. There's of course course, a whole cast of characters, historians who have looked at the last 100 years in the US, different portions of it, and extremely well. But it is really Hitchcock's polemic that went to the heart of the curatorial proposal in a way. This is why he perhaps becomes a relevant character. So in 1947, as many of you know, he described a divide in the profession involving complex US architectural firms building complex but anonymous projects on one end of the spectrum, and firms organized around the figure of a genius, architectural genius, building representative and symbolically important buildings on the other end of the spectrum. And at this time, he proposed that the model of the firm specializing in delivering industrial and basic institutional architecture had originated earlier than 47. At the turn of the century, with offices like Albert Kahn, who was one of the biggest producers of factories around Detroit for Ford and GM, but also one of the big exporters of those factories, in this case to Russia. And in Russia, he produced 500 factories. We couldn't research all of them. There's really no material we could find from where we were standing. But we found enough of them. And then this is sort of Kahn's office organization. At this particular moment, especially in Kahn's organization, there's a relationship between a kind of Taylorism of the object that he's producing and Taylorism of the organization, internal organization of the firm. So Hitchcock goes from Kahn, I said this sort of firm, anonymous firm, bureaucratic firm, is a kind of trend and phenomenon that starts with offices like Kahn's, but is in 1947 perfectly embodied by a firm like SOM. And though there is obviously a distinction between these two, and this is something that Michael makes in the article that we may not have circulated, between the kind of Taylorist organization efficiency and the corporation, which both colloquially and legally is applied to SOM at this particular point. Though Kahn incorporated in 28 already. And this is an awesome image of SOM by Ezra Stoller. So we were relying on a set of photographic evidence that comes from really important architectural photographers from this period in wherever we could find it to tell some of the stories. And this really, for us, also meant, in a more conventional vein, that we started to cultivate relationships with EXPO that I never had, certainly, and that were really fruitful and interesting to have throughout the process. So when, more than a decade later, Zodiac, Italian journal Zodiac, considered the rise to prominence of American architecture, the cultural and economic logic of that sort of post-war Pax Americana had put some of these bureaucratic offices, in Hitchcock's terms, in a position to have commissions that had to deal with symbolically important and nationally important projects abroad, in a way voiding part of the argument that he had made in 1947. And then when he writes for the Zodiac, he no longer insists on the distinction between the genius and the bureaucrat, but he still holds on to the idea that organizational and architectural proficiency went hand in hand, and that in fact when firms traveled, American firms traveled abroad, they also delivered organizational intelligence to the locations where they went. Or rather, if a firm somewhere else wanted to build American skyscraper types, they needed to learn how to be that kind of firm. So for us, this a version of that is really the kind of part of the curatorial proposition that through their foreign work, U.S. architectural firms deposited or transferred organizational intelligence on top of other types of intelligence or inflection that they might have brought or taken away from the locales in which they operated. Now, the professional workings of architectural firms have been captured and described in, obviously, the professional journals of architecture. Though many offices that we included in the repository, one no longer thinks so. They're no longer part of the kind of so for us, this was one of the things we were interested in doing. In some cases, we bring back onto the map a firm that has, in a way, fallen out of the story, like the Malin and Aldrich, the architects of the pavilion, who at their peak were as big as, if not bigger than the 2 meter mark. But generally, we don't hear about it. It was equally important to us to bring some firms that we know from various other narratives into the narrative of export and office, to see them through that other lens. And in that sense, I'd say, just as an example, the New York Five become really interesting. Because as much as we think of them as a kind of an avant-garde moment, if not operation at the time that they emerge, once they start exporting, they're all really bigger offices. They're interested in profits in a particular way. And they are no different than some other firms that we are looking at in that sense. So in any case, for various practical reasons that track directly with the basic constraints of the project, its size, the time we had to research it, the money we had and didn't have to put towards it, we decided to comb through the archives of architectural journals first. And in some cases, we were looking at images and documents in a few other places. But basically, what you get is, we also asked offices when they were alive to give us material. So this is important because it can be misconstrued in various ways. There were offices that didn't want to be part of the project, like Portland. There are a few offices that we couldn't convince at all to give us the material. And if that material was not available in journals, then we couldn't include it, right? If there was an office that was so under-documented, we didn't include it. But if there was an office that was documented, regardless of their interest in being part of this, we included them because their particular interest was irrelevant to our story. So in that sense, Portland, we had to really beg to give us material. It's only after we showed them what we were going to publish on the cover of their folder that they sent us a few images to put on the cover of the folder. Similarly, there were offices that allowed us to use the material despite their disagreement with the projects that we chose. So in this category, you have someone like SOM, really not interested in showing some of the early work for oil companies in Latin America, and NADA, who would have rather we showed something other than what we showed. So that's an important, maybe important for me that that's on the table. So in the last century, there were architectural journals that occasionally looked at the stock of US production abroad, whether that was in Forum, Record, PA. And there were architectural journals abroad who looked at US production abroad and inside. And these were our friends. This is what we were interested in. And there were also popular journals like Life and Fortune that were interested in sets of topics that talk about US working abroad, including building abroad. Both of these include projects, architectural projects. So this is where some of our material was coming, and a kind of story about USA working abroad. But we were also looking at, in this case, this is these are Hilton ads from the Hospitality Archive in Houston. So basically the way in which some of the architectural work traveled was through various programs and very particular historical circumstances that it could. Then, images of a higher value financially, like Castro on Hilton after the revolution in Cuba, or Yoko Ono and John Lennon in Hilton, Amsterdam. And as I said, we were looking at a couple of different sets of say, evidence, of material that we were particularly interested in because it was already curated and already sort of told the stories. One of them were the photographs, particularly by Julius Schulman and Ezra Stoller, of different offices in these cases. We were interested in presenting the office as a space in which architects work. In this lineage, we also had a lot of photographs from Hyungmin Pai and for the contemporary work. But for us, it was important. This was important even though we don't start it out anywhere in the exhibit. But it was important for us because architectural photography is part of the history that we were looking at. It's part of the history of office self-presentation as well as presentation of projects abroad. And then another one that we sort of get excited when we run into it was a set of diagrams that offices used to show us their organization, and that this goes as far as Pope's office, Eggers and Higgins, HRK, and so on, right? And so curators were excited about this. So it was one of the things we tried to reproduce for OfficeUS. Now, all of this material that we amassed, and there was a lot of it, basically was marshaled into a deliberately slow, analog collection that required will and curiosity to open up beyond the total, bewildering, profuse, contradictory. And the ultimate hope was that our office on the ground, real although in completely unreal conditions, might produce discussions about connectedness, historical baggage, collaboration, inefficiency, and we are yet to see how far sort of they've managed to project beyond our plastic scale vision. Okay. Yeah, we could. How far are we without time? Are we carrying enough time? Yeah. I mean, maybe I don't have a question, but an observation that I think was really important as you were talking about the exhibit. One about where one goes, and I started sort of talking about it, but one about maybe. The question is where, but the statement is about the fact that curatorial work, exhibition work allows us to be uncertain and critical in a way that actually is hard in scholarly work. Anyway.
When I was listening to the preparation work, I had heard how much research that the US Pavilion was doing, and now I'm really astounded by the amount and the meticulous nature of the work, and it made me think about the difference between the way I had done my sort of academic work, understand, and the nature of writing in this academic world. And then my experience when I went back to Korea, and at the same time we want to do meaningful work. Obviously, you continue to want to do significant things, but that the nature of the condition in a place like Korea, or I would imagine North Korea, is that there's a dearth of material. There just isn't stuff, and so there was this sort of tremendous contrast between the US Pavilion, where you have to just shift through, I imagine, an enormous amount. We had a lot of stuff, but it was stuff really. There was not that kind of documentation or archival knowledge or historical work that was behind all the things that happened. And so the kind of stuff that was going around had to be organized in a way. And so I was more sort of like creating narratives, convincing narratives, rather than trying to sort of figure out what the material was telling me in terms of, and that sort of contrast really, I think, extends to the different conditions and also to to the topic itself. What does the US office do? What is the architecture of the Korean Peninsula, which seems to be extremely different topics. But if we talk about it in terms of curatorial strategy, then we understand we have to produce sort of meaningful, significant statements or installations.
I mean, another thing that seemed to me interesting to compare is the way in which we really did transform that pavilion. I don't know if you know, if you've been to the US Pavilion at the Biennale, but it is a kind of a horrible building on its own. And we were really scared of it throughout the process. And then finally, in the end, we thought, okay, you cannot recognize the pavilion once the office and the repository are there, and we sort of had to transform it into something other than itself through various, architectural moves and also choreographic moves. But what's interesting to me is that we produced an office and you produced a living room in a way, and maybe the buildings already support that in some way. But both of those also suggest very particular ways of behaving in the space that I think are interesting to discuss.
I'm not saying this in a critical way, but when I went into US Pavilion, it was not an enjoyable experience. You go there, also you understand there's this office and it's a white space and you have all these sort of catalogs, and so do I really want to go through these things? And so it sort of had a kind of dystopic thing of all the kind of data and things that maybe are hidden, and that was a bit difficult, wasn't it?
I mean, we wanted to produce certain forms of anxiety, of course. Yes.
Yeah. So, and you really did succeed because, but of course there was this aspect of the performative aspect that you have to experience through these events, and I wasn't able to do that. So that aspect, sort of activating the space in a different way, may sort of create a different kind of experience.
Yeah, I mean, there were brainstorms going on there, but I do think that the thing that you brought up, the German pavilion, I sort of agree with your take on it, and for me, I would have wanted that one to be really uncomfortable, and it wasn't. But so I'm glad that we were able to make you uncomfortable. That's, part of looking at a mirror, the kind of mirror that we produce, ought to.
But I think your experience would be similar, but you don't really, I think, have intended to make these spaces like that. They sort of, during the process, don't they just sort of evolve into a certain thing, and then you realize what you've created? For me, that was the case. I think because I was not the architect, and I didn't really sort of, my task was not to really envision the space.
We were absolutely, our fingers were in that the whole time. So we were fully aware of the kind of visual impact that we were wanting to produce. But this is where I think, I'm interested in the domestication of the monumental buildings that you talk about. Like, that is a very different twist on.
Well, I think that 2 years ago I was involved in the Venice Biennale, and that was when David Chipperfield was, and I was involved in a project called Common Pavilions. It was an installation by Roger Dina, of Dina and Dina, and his project was to involve the Italian photographer, and he was going to document every pavilion in the Giardino. And so I was called upon to write a piece on the Korean Pavilion. I called it a house. And it was very different from all the other pavilions, which historically had a certain period when they were designed and built. And they are mostly like mausoleums when the exhibition is not there. So, and I called our pavilion a house because of the nature of the openness and the kind of small scale of that. And so I think we succeeded in sort of bringing out the nature of the pavilion, and that for me, I'm not sure it was Minseok understood what he was doing, but at a certain point where we were trying to sort of organize the things, I understood that what we had done. But I think Minseok's sort of, as an architect, take on it was he was just trying to create a kind of a particular architectural environment. And from my point of view, I think it works because of that kind of conceptual input and the very kind of specific way that we place certain images in certain places. And so the combination of that lightness and open space of a little house and the kind of material that we were displaying sort of created a kind of disjunction that was very effective, I thought. But I confess that I really didn't read it. I don't know whether he probably thinks that he knew it, but I would disagree in terms of the total sort of experience of both of intellectually sort of looking at and reading the stuff and the spatial experience.
Can we open it up to the audience?
Anybody have a question?
Yeah. It seems like in both the cases, we're using the exhibition in the research apparatus, right? Where I'm reading that the quality of the individual building, the architecture of the building is really insignificant. It's more about perhaps a building which follows, well, let's say the US situation, if it's done by an architect, the quality of architecture is not important. In the case of the Korean Pavilion, if it follows one of the kind of conceptual frameworks, it fits under one of the frameworks. So I'm interested in this idea, can any building find its way into an architectural discourse? And is by placing any building in a discourse into architecture. So the difference between architecture and religion in this case, or what kind of the statement or the position that's coming from these projects.
I don't think I can answer it directly right now, but the point is that you raised is interesting because Rem's sort of proposition was that this would be an exhibition about architecture and not architects. And so your question is this an exhibition about buildings? What is the status of great buildings, let's say, to just sort of extend that, great buildings within this sort of agenda?
Well, is the quality of the building a factor at all? Is the architectural quality at all?
I mean, I can say for us, it mattered what the buildings were as we were looking at them, and the way what we thought of them as buildings was part of how we. It affected our ability to, our desire to choose them to be part of this. But as I said from the outset, the architectural object, part of the way that we set up the curatorial proposal, inevitably made the architectural object and focus on it less important than an understanding of it within the network of various other historical, financial circumstances. And so we knew that this was a choice we were making in this particular case. Now, does that speak about our individual position in architecture? No, but this was for us a way to respond to the provocation by Ren.
I hate to deflect your question, but when I was looking at your presentation at a certain moment when you were showing the beautiful black and white photographs of the different kind of office situation, Frank Lloyd, Taliesin, and then was that HOK? It was not HOK. It was
There were different TAC.
TAC. And I thought that one way that you could have done it, which would be a much more sort of a deliberate sort of positioning that was more evident, perhaps was to show these kinds of photographs.
But they were all there.
And but you had to really go through them to discover these contrasts.
So part of what we were, in a way, also responding to deliberately is that we felt that the way, and maybe we reproduced the situation, the symptom that we were fighting, but we felt that part of the way in which images circulate in the profession is so fast. People are used to looking at images, they don't really care. We did not want to make that easier. We wanted you to care enough to see it, and to stop for long enough to actually open up one of these. If you didn't do that, then you just got the wash of the total exhibit. And we precisely did not want to cater to the person who's going to run through it.
Yeah,
well, part of the thing that we were hoping is that one would actually, at least instantaneously, get the kind of wash, the bewildering kind of experience that would be, at first, a kind of an aesthetic experience you get from the amount of things that are there. But then we were hoping that, you know, we had the kind of subject that our preferred subject would actually see something and start to follow something in the repository itself. Long enough that they would begin to care about what might be in it, sit down and look at it. And in the process of doing that, potentially engage the live office or the characters who are there working on something. So then we hope that by the end of it, and you know, in a way we were hoping that just the fact that you're entering an office gives you a set of keys for how you might behave in here. You have to mind the fact that they are there and that you have entered an office, but also care about the things that are on the wall enough to engage them. And that in the end, if you were to really compute the totality of it through some deeper moments of drilling, that you would arrive and wonder about, especially as an architect, whether you wanted to be on this wall, how you thought about your office or your agency as an architect in the larger condition. And you know, and for some of the Americans who actually went through it, wonder about your national heritage. Does that? There's a. Okay.
You talked about the selection process that you went through and the challenges that that entailed. But I'm wondering for the Korean Pavilion, what was your process of selection, and were there any challenges in that?
So compared to what Anya went through and led, particularly the MIT team, we're just totally chaotic and haphazard. You know, you just sort of like try and get people who have gone to North Korea, what is out there, and there are sort of like institutions in South Korea. Like there's an institution on North Korean information and data, and so you go through that and things, but very little on architectural issues, and so it's almost hit and miss, and so it's such a contrasting way that we accumulate the potential material, and so the systematicity of the way that Anya had worked and the kind of haphazardness that we went through is just, I think, astonishing.
But we also, I'd say, worked at very different grains. I think the Korean Pavilion curated voices that already were producing some knowledge about North or South. Whereas in our case, we worked with pieces of evidence and sort of statements that historians have made to bring them back. But we did not, nothing in the US Pavilion is commissioned quite the same way as the pieces in the Korean.
And so I think Anya sort of went through a kind of archival process, but at the end you deliberately then again sort of subsumed, you know, those images that were, I think, were beautiful, and I don't think you can really make those connections. You have to probably, the probability of someone actually going through those 5 images are probably like,
absolutely,
is very, very small. And so we deal with sort of like images as they are in their sort of raw aesthetic nature. I think because they're out there, they were mostly created for certain aesthetic and artistic purposes. And so the issue was not, and we of course wanted to do research on that, but it was very, very limited. And so so there's all these stuff going. Then of course, how do you make sense of it? And that was, as I talked just a minute ago, that how you organize them, and then sort of maybe create a narrative for these various.
It's very hard for me to think of the paintings, the room of paintings that you had, or the Chris Marker as raw. Neither of those feel like raw material somehow. They feel like very specific, deliberate voices.
Raw in the sense that we used them, we looked at them first and foremost as images within certain spaces. And then of course you research them, why was Chris Marker there, what did he write, you know, what was the other things. And then you sort of consider where to place them. And so I think the initial sort of instinct for us, at least, was to look at the impact of the images and then go into the research and see the kind of logic and historical background to these things. And that's the way we work with the shape. I think it was very different.
Stan.
Thank you both for your presentations. I've not seen your catalogs, and presumably give me quite a different impression of it. What I clearly presented this evening is that you were both intent on producing evidence, and there was a question about what values in architecture. You could also ask what were the propositions historically as well. What are the propositions that are being put forward here? Either maybe I'll find them in the catalog. It seemed to me that you are sort of trying to stop short at the level of evidence. I wonder if there's any truth in what I just said. Does that partially descend from the way Graham set up the Biennale? He ordinarily is not a person who avoids taking positions himself, but was there something about the way the entire proposition was set for REM that would encourage the be more evidentiary than that proposition?
Absolutely. I mean, to look at 100 years of absorbing modernity takes you to, it's from the outset a kind of a historical question. Different pavilions responded to this differently, but they all looked at history as their material, and whether that's evidence or history.
Say that the historical dimension would take you away from value judgments of architecture, but it shouldn't take you away from propositions of others.
Well, for me, I was hoping that sort of presenting Drexler's transformations as a key reference makes clear the extent to which we felt what we needed to do was a kind of critical mirror, and that is curatorially, that's a part of the proposition. Critical mirror of what occurred over the last 100 years, allowing one to judge what we think was problematic in many cases, and interesting in others. And also, secondly, for us, the office, in the most ideal scenario, which probably is not going to really fully materialize, was going to make statements about organization of architectural offices and sort of the world. But we didn't make those statements for them. We gave them a kind of a setting from which they could produce statements that are appropriate for their generation. Now, they may fail, and in that case, that's part of the kind of the mirror proposal that we are instilling. Don't tell them that I said this.
As you mentioned back about the offices, I love those pictures too. And you mentioned generation. I saw myself in the 50s, shirt and all blacks.
I mean, that's another thing that you absolutely see from the office images is the extent to which they are ruled by white men in white shirts for, you know, most of everything that's there. 180 offices, really, they all sort of look like that. So for us, there are smaller stories that we inscribed into the choices that we made in every single case. That we thought, you know, for example, the Hilton ads are what is on the Hilton projects. So if you slow down enough, you start to see that there's actually a whole series of these that travels through history. And basically the choice of the kind of image and the relationship that we made, they may not become obvious to someone. Someone will not make all the connections that we knew existed. But we also banked on the numbers in that sense. If only one of those folders got drilled by someone, that was enough for us. Right?
Just to finish, the first one is on the screen right now.
I know, that's not. Yeah, that's just bad projector.
Stan's comment is very interesting because one of the controversies after the exhibition went up was the elements section in REMS. And the 14 elements that were perceived as presenting these elements without a proposition of what architecture was. And so that REMS sort of provocation was presenting architecture without a proposition. And that was the great sort of point of controversy and consternation. And so that was the way I think, Rem made his proposition that he would sort of create a kind of degree zero and then begin from that. And I think maybe for us, that was not our intention, but the way that our commissioner worked as a kind of disciple of Rem was the way you should sort of begin without really trying to without having a thesis, and then sort of seeing what happens.
I mean, for us, there's no question that we thought of this, and certainly, this is not the voice that I normally take amongst the three curators, but one of the things that we absolutely believed was that we are producing a platform from which something new can emerge. Something that's going to be aware of the baggage, but potentially better. Now, we couldn't really articulate more than that what that was, but that was a kind of the hope of the project.
I want to thank everybody. We have to cut it short. We'll linger a little bit for a few people, but I saw some hands raised.